And I think part of the reason why, honestly, we have some of the race relations or tensions that we have specifically in our country is because those that do not want us to be a part of the pie, those that don't want to share, those that don't want to help us, potentially win Monopoly, right? Those that were the little kids that were like, mine, 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 these are my toys, not yours, when you went over their house, they see it. They see how quickly, if you just give us access and resources, if you just give us the same opportunities, we are going to be successful. And not just as successful as you, we're probably going to be even more successful. And that's really scary for people that have ownership and power that don't want to share the wealth.
You're tuned in to Soul Force Ones, a podcast where we take fresh and revolutionary out-of-the-box approaches to interrogating professionalism and the workplace, exploring how careers, activism, spirituality, and hip-hop, otherwise known as cash, rules everything around us. We're about making moves and taking action, so we're teaming up with People of Color Clothing. More than clothing, it's an experience. We're also creating an experience here. So in the spirit of building and coming together, we're doing the same with People of Color Clothing. Go to their website, peopleofcolorclothing.com, buy a hoodie, a t-shirt, enter Soul Force Ones, and get 10% off your purchase. And Darius is already hooking you up with free shipping. So that's promo code Soul Force Ones at peopleofcolorclothing.com.
Invested in my mutuals, a hustle hard as infinite. Watch him say we did it, yeah. It ain't easy, never is. I just focus on my grind, I put my walk where talking is. They might say we lucky, yeah, but my boots is muddy, yeah. We be in that traffic going spastic, get to clapping, yeah. You are not a factor, yeah, unless I see you trapping here. In and out the studio, just like a ghost, you never there. Don't run from it, no, I know you don't want it. See that summit, I'ma touch it, yeah. Ball it on a budget, every nugget, I'ma shine on. Customers, they line up, fit to put my sign on. Luxury designer, see the silver line, boy, you basic, later primer, candy paint, prime time it, in the gate, where you find it, I'm a diamond, not a mine. Edges need a line, future so bright that the light is getting blind, and I work, yeah, work, baby, work.
With Soul Force Ones, I'm MC Stoll. We got DJ Cole on the Soul Force Ones and Twos, and our feature on this track, Cypher, is Giselle Ruiz. So let's get to work. Giselle, thank you for rocking the proverbial mic with us. Your working title is Global Talent Acquisition with TikTok, and I want to get into that a little bit.
It's been a week, but haters gonna hate. You know, that's what it is right now, and we're just doubling down. Amazon just had all their employees have to immediately delete TikTok off their app.
That TikTok stuff, just because Trump is jealous that TikTok activism got the better of him, or what?
I think it's a lot of xenophobia in our country right now with COVID. China and the U.S. And many other countries, frankly, have a pretty contentious relationship. So it's all stemming from all of that. I think it's a lot of egos getting in the way. And then you've got the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Instagrams, the Apples of the world that frankly are just threatened. Like, we're a 2-year-old company and we're like, it's a global phenomenon and they don't even know what to do, And it's kind of discouraging because we should be like industry peers instead of competitors. Like, there's enough billions of people on the planet for all of these companies to sort of like coexist together, and we have a different value proposition than what you get on Instagram, than what you get on Twitter. Like, let's have everybody be able to make choices in terms of what social media platforms they want to be involved in. But they're not trying to hear it. I mean, Zuckerberg's been all over us from day one about like data privacy issues, and now Amazon, right? Obviously Bezos is feeling some sort of way. I mean, to make that level of a stance, to go out to press and to say like all of our employees have to shut down TikTok immediately without even coming to the table and speaking to us as a company, or like, you know, reach out to, you're Jeff Bezos, like reach out to our founder, reach out to our CEO. You can get anybody on the phone and be like, yo, what's up? Like, what's going on? Should we be concerned about, you know, personal data breach security issues? And that like just didn't happen. They kind of just like went to market with this news, which is a bit shady. So I think it's a combination of a lot of different things, and just the state where we are in the world, and you know, it's people's monies and pockets, and they clearly feel threatened. If we were an American company and not a Chinese company, then, you know, we could say the same thing about everyone else. Like, I have an iPhone, they've got all my stuff. Like, you know what I mean? Like, everything we use, our laptops, our computers, like everyone has our data, right? But we're making it about like, well, TikTok has our data, but they're giving it to China, which is obviously a communism, and it's just so not true. So, you know, there's definitely more to come. I think like this is way above my pay grade, but I think the solution here is like TikTok's just going to have to become an American entity, which by the way, right now we're incorporated in the Cayman Islands anyway. Like, we're technically not a Chinese company. Our parent company is a Chinese company. But it's, you know, it's really interesting to get this level of scrutiny as you know, as a company that was founded by brown people, right? Like, of course, right? If it was another white cisgender male from Harvard and Stanford that founded another major tech company, we wouldn't be saying anything, you know. But because it's a Chinese company and it's been founded in a different region outside of the U.S. and it's so successful, then all of a sudden it's a problem. Which I know all of this conversation will sort of lead to sort of like diversity and all of that, but it just continues to reflect to me like the state that we are in the world, where we just are not, especially as Americans, like we're just like not trying to be concerned about the fact that there's a whole nother world out there, and like that the sun doesn't revolve around us, you know?
Well, and this is so much, I think, bigger, as you've mentioned, than even you in your role, but even just TikTok. Like, I'm thinking about G5 and how they arrested that woman, right? I forgot that company. Yeah. You're probably more. But this is a bigger thing that we're talking about in terms of world politics and power, and it's all right there. It's all about that power and money at the end of the day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So more to come. I mean, it's been a week for us because every day has been something new. And again, I think back to the Amazon thing, it's just kind of like, you just play nice in the sand, you know what I mean? Like, don't go and make such a because you know, when you say something like that as Amazon, then everyone else is going to freak out and be like, okay, well, if Jeff is telling us to take this off our phones, then, you know, and he knew that, right? So to me, that's the part that upsets me, is like, that's real shady when you are just like, okay, I know that if I make this level of a power move, it's going to ripple effect. Versus if you actually truly were really concerned about breach of data and privacy security, you would have gone across the table and had a conversation with our leaders to address that particular issue, versus going to market and saying like everybody has to shut down TikTok immediately. So
is TikTok, Dance Bite, is it publicly traded? Because this reminded me of so it's not, because that reminded me of, I think it was Microsoft. It was somebody who came out about Zoom and put them on blast, and then you saw the drop in stock, right? Like, this all plays with people's pockets. It all has, you know, ripple effects.
Exactly. And I'm like, Bezos, do you need any more money, bro? Like, you got so much money. Like, come on. No one's TikTok is not taking down Amazon. Like,
on your LinkedIn, it includes diversity, equity, inclusion, global talent acquisition, trailblazer, rainmaker, coach. Rainmaker got my attention, and so tell me more about it. What is a rainmaker?
Yeah, LinkedIn, the way that I sort of self-classify myself. So rainmaker for me is like a disruptor, right? To me, it's I sort of have prided my career, and both personally and professionally, on like I don't want to go into any organization and be status quo. I don't want to go and sort of just like collect a paycheck and sort of do whatever my responsibilities or qualifications are. I want to make sure that I'm contributing and that whatever amount of time I am a part of that, whatever system, organization, institution, I'm doing my part to make it better. I'm doing my part to evolve it. I'm doing my part to challenge, to, have disruptive and uncomfortable conversations and to sort of challenge things that have been done day in and day out simply because someone else created a system and that said this is how everyone's going to do it. So to me, that everything you mentioned is all encompassing of that, and how I really try to approach both my personal, but definitely my professional life. And I'm blessed to be at a point in my career where like I don't really have to walk into any space where I don't have the opportunity to be that rainmaker or to be that trailblazer, because I frankly won't stand for anything less. So that's how I would define that.
I love the disruption. I was thinking that you work in talent acquisition. You're acquiring talent. They're getting paid. You're making it rain for them, in a sense.
Oh, okay. I like that too. I'm gonna incorporate that.
All right.
I'm gonna incorporate that. Yes, I am helping.
I like what you said too, because I was
make it rain. I like that. I'm definitely gonna incorporate that because I definitely am about making it rain. As a global talent acquisitions professional, really what my focus is, like, I'm responsible for bringing people into organizations. And I was saying my current vessel right now is TikTok. And for me, that's all about access and opening doors and really helping people have economic empowerment, right? We think of our jobs as just like something we do, but really it's an extension of who we are. And it really sets up what our life and our lifestyle are going to be. It dictates what neighborhoods we can live in, which then dictates what schools our kids will go to and what their education will be. It dictates whether we're able to buy and invest in stock or property or build our own businesses, and so much more. And so there's so many groups, underrepresented groups that have been marginalized and disenfranchised and underserved, underrepresented, that get left out day in and day out of that economic empowerment and the opportunity to make it rain. So I'm really focused on doing my part to create that access and open as many doors as possible to those groups of people.
Yeah, I like how you talked about the title being temporary as well, because I introduced you as your working title, knowing that changed, that we are more than this title and this position. And I love how you frame it in terms of, I'm showing up with my whole self and being authentic and being a disruptor, because I think right now I'm trying to have conversations with students about naming the fact that you are doing activism. And it's not that you put on your resume that you're holding up a sign necessarily, but the leadership skills that you're gaining from that. And there was an article in the Huffington Post, and I'm going to quote a couple of people, and I was interested in your thoughts about what these people, how they've approached activism. So Edgar Natahu, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, is the executive director of the nonprofit Workplace Fairness. And he said, unfortunately for some people, when they hear protester, they think looter. If you're a well sought out employer and you're sifting through thousands of resumes, you're going to go with a sure bet. And then Tracy Porter Stevens, she's a human resources professional at the enterprise platform Grapevine 6. She said she would question whether a candidate was a quote unquote troublemaker if they listed protesting on a resume. And so I think it's more about what you're saying in terms of, like, we talk about wanting to disrupt systems. We want to change. We don't want the status quo. I think every business recognizes that. Retail is going out of business. If you're not changing, you're dead tomorrow, right? So you can't maintain status quo. So if you want to change status quo, who's better than an activist? Like, I want more activists in corporate America than I want necessarily just running to nonprofits, right?
As a human resources strategist sort of and professional, I think it's really important to think holistically about hiring practices. I think a lot of hiring happens from a qualification, this many years of experience, or these are the responsibilities, as opposed to competencies, right? Like, how can we really identify what are the competencies that are needed for someone to be able to do the job? And to your point, like someone who's who takes initiative, who's a leader, who's scrappy, who's active, who's hungry, who's determined, who has had adversity or sees perseverance, who is selfless in their pursuit and sort of helping others. Those things to me are so much more valuable than they've had 3 years of working experience or they went to a certain college or institution, right? And so, again, systems have been set up to leave many people out. When you have a job description that says someone needs to have a college degree or someone needs to have this many years of experience, that is inherently racist, or it can be inherently sexist and or any of the other ists, right? Because what you're saying is that you don't understand that for certain people to have had access to that level of education or to have had access to those previous employers in order for you to consider them a strong enough and qualified candidate is that you're not understanding all of the systems that really limited them from being able to have those opportunities. Not because they weren't qualified or just as qualified to be able to attend those institutions, but because they were left out of that equation. And frankly, that starts off as kindergarten, right? So when I'm having conversations with my business leaders about job descriptions or qualifications, I break it all the way down, right? And I've done a lot of work in education reform. I've done a lot of work in sort of equity and what that means versus diversity and inclusion. And so when I'm talking to my clients and business leaders, what I say is, you know, do you know that property taxes in your city dictate public education, right? And so therefore, from the moment that our children are born and even where they start school, they are already limited in terms of like what their life trajectory is going to be for the next 40 years. Where they're going to work, where they're going to go to school, what opportunities they're going to have access to. So when you sit in front of me today and say, I want somebody that went to Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, or already worked at, you know, BCG, Deloitte, Amazon, Google, Disney, then what you're telling me is that you don't understand that that's such a limited pool of people that even had access to those opportunities, and you're defining those as the best of the best when inherently they're just the people that got lucky the minute they were born.
Mm-hmm.
Pardon the interruption. This week's remix comes in the middle of our interview with Giselle, where John and I will interrogate the notion of racism in job applications and asking for prior experience. Join us for this short conversation, and then we'll return to our interview with Giselle Ruiz.
So yeah, Giselle, she mentioned how asking applicants how many years of experience they have is racist. And I work in career development, and I feel like that's so central. In just having my own experience, being a part of interview processes and interviewed, I feel like that's standard across the board. People ask you your years of experience. And so I never considered that to be racist. And I forgot to ask that follow-up question of Giselle, so I figured we could have a conversation about that. What do you think? Is asking people their years of experience, is that racist?
As you say that right now, I think it's more nuanced than that. It's not just, are we asking them how much experience they have, but it's what type of experience. And I think that's where the racism comes in. Because if you're asking professional experience, list down the different jobs that you've had, who you've worked for, in what spaces, access to those spaces is definitely policed in certain ways, or access is easier for a lot of folks, right? If you think of like legacy, right? Well, my dad works in the law office, so I just grew up hanging out there, right? I think a lot of access to those spaces is not available to a lot of POC.
So I agree with that, because when she was talking about, you know, certain companies might be specific that they want an applicant or a candidate from Harvard or Deloitte, and that's being very specific and narrow to where you're generally more likely to get a white male because of, to your point, that access and who is at those companies or who are at those institutions, right? Being predominantly white male. I guess I wonder if something like, you know, you're a supervisor, and so we want somebody who has 5 years of supervisory experience. Because when I'm going through hundreds of resumes, I got to have some way of filtering people in and out, right? To narrow it down so that I have finalists to interview.
There's that saying of like, people hire folks who remind them of themselves. So white men will be more likely to hire white men who have a background that looks like their background. And I think it gets back to that idea of like, right, experience doing what? So in education, we have this idea of funds of knowledge. And it's understanding that all students bring so much to the classroom, and we're not just looking for one type of academic skill set and experience. Students can have a lot of experience with gardening or construction or sports or all types of different things, different types of literacy, different types of texts that they see in their household that aren't necessarily academic, but they're there. And when folks come into the classroom, if we just look at them through this narrow lens, I think this is sort of overlapping between how career development and professionalism and sort of education in terms of just looking at a sliver of the whole person and who they are and what they bring, that it's super middle class, white, Eurocentric, English speaking, right? All of this. So just if you briefly want to mention for folks that one story you bring up of working with the students, sort of coaching, and they asked about, they didn't put something on their CV because they felt like it wasn't relevant experience. I think that's a perfect example of how asking for experience, work experience, is racist.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at is this idea of fitting in, and what does it mean to fit into the culture, to that box, to that narrow way of a company understanding their culture and what they're looking for, and then how that has implications on how we tend to, particularly people of color, people with marginalized identities, tend to have that imposter syndrome where they don't have the confidence in themselves. So the example that you were referring to is a young Latina, young woman who, through her life, her family, actually, even to this day, I think during the summer, she will return home and work in the fields with her family to provide additional income to help the family make ends meet. And so she wants to be an advocate for farm workers. And so we were having so she's a public health student. And when I asked her about where that experience, in terms of already having worked in the field, where that shows up on her resume, she replied that it's unprofessional, that that's not professional experience, so it wouldn't be on her resume, right? And so it was an inability for her to see that connection, obviously the most direct connection, the fact that she's worked in the field, she's translated for family members and other people, she has direct experience, she knows the conditions, the difficulty of working in the field. But even beyond that, in terms of the public health reference and relevance, is the fact that if you think of people who have strong work ethics, I was talking to this guy at one of our career fairs, and from his perspective, he distinguished someone as having a strong work ethic if they had served in the military, if they had served as a farm worker, or had served as like working outdoors, like in kind of rugged physical environments, which, you know, certainly would be the case with working in the fields. And so, yeah, it was just the realization that she was struggling with that imposter syndrome, the idea that her experiences, what she's done, isn't relevant in the corporate environment. And I'm like, man, if you've worked in 90 to 100 degree weather picking strawberries, sitting in an air-conditioned office doing some data analysis, like, that's nothing, right? So let's give you credit for what you've done and where you've come from.
Yeah, and my question is just, where did those lessons come from, right? It's not that she doesn't value that time and that work and that experience. It's that she knows, because she's been told so often through, I don't know if it's television, if it's through classes, if it's through articles that she's read, if it's from conversations, that isn't welcome in that space, or that
right.
That isn't the type of experience that they're looking for, because it's not quote unquote professional, right? So just thinking about those types of things, when you're asking for their work experience, it's different than asking a person about their experiences. Okay. And if we ask them about their experiences and it's more open, we get a more holistic view of who this person is, rather than when you say, what is your work experience? Please list it. Right. And then on job applications, it's like, who is your employer? What is their phone number? Who is, you know?
Well, it's this idea that the professional self and the work self are two different people.
And I think Giselle was talking about that, how this is her work. This is her personal and professional ministry. And I get that not all of us are in a role where, you know, if I work on the factory line, I go back home, I'm no longer doing that work. Those are separate selves, and they are separate environments. So I'm aware of that distinction in a lot of our employment and work. But in terms of, to your point, work experience versus experience, how you're presenting it in terms of experience allows me to mine my experiences, whether that's working in the fields or babysitting or doing all of these things that I, as a single mother, might do in terms of managing schedules and cooking, like all of the different responsibilities, how those are relevant to the work experience, right? In terms of the transferable skills. I guess the challenge is how, when you're going through that initial step of that application and you have to filter out hundreds of people potentially when there's, you know, let's say 1,000 applications, how do you do that in a way where that individual can bring up those transferable skills? Because I do agree that there's an opportunity in the interview to articulate and communicate some of those things, and perhaps even in a cover letter you can communicate it, but the application is very, by design, rigid and narrow.
I think part of that is, yeah, by design it's rigid and narrow, but then we're going to end up having very similar folks come in to replace folks who have left, right? There's very little change. And something that folks will hear in the next episode when we speak with Jaman is his take on, right, the importance of diversity in tech. And I think there's also that diversity of having folks who aren't within that narrow sort of box that we're asking about.
And how that leads to diversity of thought, and how that leads to diversity of thought.
Yeah, and it's something that I wonder all the time about the PhD, right? Like, I see folks, I have colleagues and friends who are cut out for this. It's their jam, they love it, the pressures that come with it, the writing, the reading, that type of analysis, they're made for it. I am not. And certain things I like, a lot of it I don't. I don't feel like it's my world. I don't feel like I belong. And I wonder, right? I mean, there are different ways of taking it. One is, this isn't my place, I got to get out of here. And there is that temptation. The other one is, maybe I have something to contribute because this isn't my world and other folks won't be bringing necessarily the same lens or the same experiences or the same voices with me, that maybe I can push back against certain things, right? If we only have people who fit the mold getting into the system and reproducing it, there's going to be very little change. I'm not saying that I'm going to bring the change, right? But somehow in that conflict, maybe there's some potential that if I leave, there won't be that same, I don't know, conflict or tension. And how much of that personally as well do I take on, right? If this isn't for me. So I don't know, but I just wonder, you know, if there are a limited amount of positions and we're filling them with the same types of people, then things will continue as they are. I don't know. I've never been on a hiring committee. I've had very bad interviews where I feel like they've had a very clear-cut idea of who they want. They ask questions. There's no back and forth. You know, I was asked about my educational experience, and I told them about doing my bachelor's in Ecuador and this and that, and like there was no follow-up of like, well, that's interesting, or why did you, it was just on to the next question. Okay. Felt terrible.
Because you felt like that experience was devalued?
I was devalued. There was no interest in me.
Got it.
From the get-go. You know, another thing is like they showed up 15 minutes late, didn't say thank you for waiting, walked in to interview me, went through the questions, you know, and now every time I pass that school or I see these folks, I just go, okay, you know, if a job opens up, I'm not going to apply. I'm not going to recommend anyone work there.
You know what I think is really interesting is that people with marginalized identities navigate this world very aware of their marginalized identity. And so I think, yeah, part of what we're talking about is creating a hiring process that values the experiences and thus the individual and who they are in a way that makes them more comfortable so that they can share their authentic selves, as opposed to this construct that devalues them, and in which case that perpetuates that imposter syndrome.
And how much of that is capitalism as well, where we don't value the person, where we're looking for just one skill and that's it. I need you to come in here in these 8 hours, do this function, and then you can go home.
Right, that's a matter of if you just want somebody to complete a task or if you want a leader. And a leader isn't someone who just supervises other people. It's someone who leads, and you develop and create a culture in an environment that is conducive to creating leaders when you encourage them to be their authentic self. So we were talking about being critical. And so you create a culture in which you embrace critical thinking. Like, I embrace my employees challenging me, right? And offering a different perspective. Because I had to check my ego and be like, all right, this isn't about me. This is about what we're trying to build together. And so I don't always have all the answers. And that's what a good leader does, is bring in the experts. I got my own shortcomings. I got a staff member who's a very strong editor. Let me lean on her expertise and her skill set, as opposed to feeling bad about I wrote something that wasn't as strong, and so now she's critiquing me and I'm taking it personal. It's not about me, right? So checking our ego and empowering others to step up and for them to lead, and that often happens through them being themselves.
Yeah. So, is asking for work experience racist?
I went into this thinking, no. I don't know if I've changed my mind. It's nuanced. I don't know if...
John.
Yeah.
What in the United States, we could say the world, let's just go U.S., what in the U.S. is not racist?
So, it's all racist. Tear down the whole damn system.
I mean,
where do you start? Where do you end? I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying, and I don't necessarily disagree. It's just, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's in the water, like I say all the time. It's in the flame. It's everywhere.
I just wonder, I think I first was kind of pushed on this when a teacher said that said deadlines were racist.
Yeah.
In education. And at the university level, it's something that we had never just really thought about in that space.
Right. For this conversation, you were late.
Mm-hmm.
Some people will say like promptness, right? Because you have like CPT, color people time.
Wow, calling me out. But yes.
Yeah. So were you being racist?
I feel like part of that I picked up.
Or was I being racist for expecting you to conform to my expectations of being on time?
How dare you call me racist? I think that's interesting. That could go both ways, right? But it's cultural, right? And it's especially in the U.S., right? Like promptness.
I think that's it. It's the expectation of dominant social cultural norms. And people will say, well, you're in America, so you should assimilate to the cultural norms. But that's forgetting and ignoring this long history of racism in which that particular cultural norm is put up on a pedestal and everyone else is expected to assimilate to it, right? Because even that dominant cultural norm wasn't the dominant cultural norm, because there were indigenous people here, and then you impose your dominant cultural norm and said, oh, you black and brown people have to do things this way.
Right. And it reflects a larger world view, right? Like I'm someone who, I was reading a work, Con Respeto, which is an ethnography by Guadalupe Valdez, I think. I'll have to check that. But she looks at the educational experiences of Mexican American families and how they navigate their children's education. And she used a phrase saying that Mexican families are oftentimes more present time oriented. And that stuck with me because I can say, damn, I'm always late. But being present time oriented, I feel reflects much more the way that if I'm talking with someone, if we're talking here and I have something coming up, my focus is on the present. And not just that, but our conversation, right? And that connection in the moment with the person that you're with. It's not that someone is being sort of reckless or careless or disrespectful but that's not even here yet, right? So a little bit of it is just, I think, a different worldview, and that is something that I think time we don't always understand is something, I don't know if I can say racialized and gendered, but it is, right? Expectations, what is expected of folks in time, I think does depend, and I don't know. I feel like without a doubt, right? If we look at job applications, interviews, if we look at the process, we could say that the first way that folks get filtered out is their name on the application. And we know that that's racist.
Yes, that is definitely
And then if you're calling them and they have an accent, you might not give them that second or the interview, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, folks are racialized and gendered a lot of different ways, and that factors into the decision-making process. And I'd say it's racist from the beginning.
I think we'll end
But
there.
that's also not my world. I don't have the experience of doing that.
No.
It's white collared people, right? And we're not focusing on who's really suffering right here. Yes, black people as a whole, but let's talk about poor black people in particular, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think socioeconomics is again, there's a lot of intersectionality with all of these things, and I think for me, I'm really thankful that I get to play in this space, but also like, this is my reality. This is my truth. It's not just what I do for work. I'm a woman of color. I'm Afro-Latina, so I identify black as my race, Latina as my ethnicity. I'm first generation immigrant. My mom came here as a single mom, 8 months pregnant with me in the 80s to New York City. Speaks no Spanish, has no education. Speaks no English, has no education. So I'm a first generation American, right? I grew up poor, right? So there's just so many different layers and levels that when we start having these conversations, we want to make it very black and white. And not really focusing on the socioeconomics, right? Yes, my focus tends to be on black and brown communities because those tend to be the underrepresented groups that have the most inequity and the most gaps across the board. But, there are a lot of white, low socioeconomic people that grew up in poverty. When we talk about immigration, we tend to really focus on Latinos, right? Especially, we say ICE and we say immigration issues, and we're thinking about just like Mexican or Central American children at the border. But you know what? We have Eastern European DACA, and we have, other immigrants from all over different regions and parts of the world, right? And so I think in general, we're not paying enough attention to the intersectionality of some of these challenges and barriers, and definitely not enough into the socioeconomic implications.
A lot of people think of themselves as this self-made millionaire or, that individualism, that American individualism. When I think of you and I think of your mother, the sacrifice, all the people that came before you that paved the way. And so this is a community that you've leaned on, that you've relied on, and you doing the same now for other people as well. What Van Lassen, I think he called like having a baton and just making, it's not necessarily passing that baton, but making that baton big enough to where everyone can get their hand on it. And we're building and carrying this together.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's so much I can say on that. So cut me off if I digress
too
much.
Go.
Where do I start? Yes, plus, right? It's a tribe, it's a community, and it's also being able to see, and I think this is an important topic that should be brought into, frankly, like the BLM movement around the intersectionality of the immigrant experience, because in just one generation, with my mom choosing to come to the United States without an education, without the qualifications, frankly, to be able to sustain her life here, and frankly continues to be handicapped 40 years later because she can't speak English. So I have to do everything for her still, because even in the United States of America, where Latinos are the largest minority group in our country by 2025, we still don't have the resources available to support them because we feel like they should learn English. So that, that aside, I have to, support her in doing mundane everyday tasks that are sort of like normal every day for all of us. But in just one generation, I'm the first to go to college. I'm the first to have a master's degree. I'm definitely the first to make over 6 figures. I will be the first to, own a home. I want to be the first to get a PhD. to invest in property, to build my own business, to work at all, like I've worked at the top like 3 or 5 companies on the planet. It's unbelievable. And that's not me. That's my mom sitting in Dominican Republic, 40 plus years ago and being like, I want something better for my future children that don't even exist. And then leaving everything she knows behind, her entire family, going to New York City in the 80s and 90s in the middle of a crack epidemic, and like surviving off of welfare and food stamps and subsidized housing. In one generation, she's been able to do that for me, right? And as a single mom with 2 kids in New York City. So she's beyond incredible and amazing, and probably would never reflect on that reflected it in that way. But wow, what am I going to be able to do for my children just one generation later, right? So I'm finding out about investments and stocks in my late 30s. My kid's going to find out about it when he's 5, right? Like, we're just going to make sure that we double down. And so I think it's just so critical. And I think part of the reason why, honestly, we have some of the race relations or tensions that we have specifically in our country is because those that do not want us to be a part of the pie, those that don't want to share, those that don't want to help us, potentially win Monopoly, right? Those that were the little kids that were like, mine, 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 these are my toys, not yours, when you went over their house, they see it. They see how quickly, if you just give us access and resources, if you just give us the same opportunities, we are going to be successful. And not just as successful as you, we're probably going to be even more successful. And that's really scary for people that have ownership and power that don't want to share the wealth.
I've always thought of it as white people, like vanilla ice cream. And when you mix it with chocolate, people are afraid that the vanilla is just going to be overcome by the chocolate ice cream, that there's like this inherent fear in that.
Not everyone's down with the swirl, with the Neapolitan.
No, but it's true, because I'm multiracial. My dad's white, and then my mom came here as an immigrant from Kenya. My family's Indian, but there's an Indian population in Kenya. There's a whole history there that has to do with colonization of Goa and of the Portuguese, and that's a whole history there. But in terms of being raised by my mother, whose parents had died and not having met them, but the access that I had from my dad and that side of the family, so I did learn about stocks, right? Like, I have a certain level of white privilege simply because my dad is white, even though I might operate in this space, in a brown place, but particularly with light complected, like, all of that matters, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And then there's so many layers to it, because then look at your story, the intersectionality of, and that was just like, I heard 5 seconds of it. Like, imagine having a full conversation on just that. And I'm sure Colin has an even, similar interesting background as well. And you then layer into that sort of like colorism that exists within our, within our different communities, and sort of like being a white passing Latino versus a dark passing Latino, and, challenges that we have amongst our own groups. And then let's not even get into the indigenous, challenges and issues that sort of come up as well. And also this like model minority, right? What does it mean in the U.S. to be Asian, specifically, let's say Indian or Korean or Chinese or Japanese? And, I was on a panel the other day where I was called out by one of the Asian panelists. Not in ill intention, but I kept saying black and brown, because that's just sort of like the cursor and the verbiage that I use. And she was like, yeah, well, yellow is here too. And I was like, well, first of all, that's not an appropriate way to, to self-identify people of Asian backgrounds. We kind of threw that one out with Oriental, quite some time ago. But let me just clarify, because this was a really important moment for me to sort of self-reflect on like perception is reality, around this idea that like when I say black and brown, to me, it's anything that is not white, cisgender, heterosexual male.
Right.
That's what I mean.
Yes.
It's every other group that is not part of the most powerful group in the world, which are white, straight males. But it was interesting because it was such a moment, and I will qualify that moving forward. But I think, again, even amongst minority groups, we have like the oppression Olympics, and who suffered more, and Like when people are wanting to distinct themselves and say, okay, well, we're Asian and we're different. Yes, and, that's part of the conversation that needs to be had. Or Latinos for BLM. Well, every Latino nation had African slaves. Actually, we had more African slaves brought to Latin America than the United States, right? So there's just so much education and awareness that people don't understand. And I keep saying, like, by the time we're all done with this, we're going to be, naked and hungry sitting in a corner in our rooms, because you're just going to find out how much racism is in everything. I think the newest one that came on my radar last night was like, the ice cream truck song apparently is like some super racist, N-word eats watermelon song. And now, it's just like every single day, now that we're starting to peel back the onions and we are part of global communities, and frankly, being virtual and inside is forcing us to really face some of our demons. And it's asking people to sort of like do your own research. And once you start doing that, it is just so hard, because you just see it so blatantly. You see it in, visas. So one of the other things I always mention that now came to mind that was a pivotal moment for me as a Dominican American was like, people don't realize what it means to have a blue passport, right? And I call it a blue passport because that's how it was brought up to me growing up. And having a blue American passport means that we can go anywhere in the world. There's literally not one country on this planet that says Americans can't come in. Now it's different because of COVID, and that's a different situation. But having a blue passport, we might need to get a visa here and there. But for the most part, Americans have carpe diem, carte blanche to go anywhere on the planet. And because we're Americans, we don't realize that that's just an American thing. It is really hard to be part of any other nation on the planet and go anywhere else. Go for vacation, go for school, go to live there. Go if you fell in love with somebody and that lives in a different country and you want to now be with them. It is like so hard. And not just like Trump hard because of right now, but like always hard, right? And it's so I've always just had such a deep connection to that, because I value what it is to be American as a global citizen. But I think it's so important for people to realize that part of the challenges that we have is that, especially as Americans, we don't recognize that. Like, we just don't recognize our privilege. We don't speak multiple languages. We travel less than any other nation on the planet. Don't quote me on that. I don't have the direct statistics.
But what you were describing is that privilege that we enjoy as Americans, that, again, just like white privilege, just like the privilege of being a man, oftentimes that's the very essence of the privilege, is because we don't have to be aware of it. We don't have to think about it. It's just right there. It's ever present. And, the racism, it's in the water in Flint. It's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And so in a situation like this, I think about that, what you were talking about is that oneness. It goes beyond any of these identities, and really embracing that oneness that we share across all of these lines that we try to put in place to divide one another, but recognizing that those lines are put in place to maintain systems of power, that people are benefiting from that. Hey, so that idea of inside, like when we're going inside, like we're inside bunkering down, but I also think of it in terms of, so I've been in career development now for like 6 months. This is new to me. I've been in higher ed for 20 years, but I've found that this experience is very spiritual in a sense. Like we talk about values, finding a higher purpose. What is your meaning? What is your fulfillment? Like, how is your work spiritual?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's honestly, I think it's an aggregate of everything that I've discussed, because this isn't something, like, this is my life's work, right? And again, I feel really privileged that I get to get a paycheck, frankly, for doing what I would be doing for free, which is what we've been told all of our lives we should be doing anyway. This doesn't shut off for me at 5 o'clock. Like, every conversation that I have at work is the same conversation I'm having with both of you right now, is the same conversation that I have with all of my personal friends. This is what I'm always talking about. This is what I'm most passionate about. So it is not like a hat that I put on and then take off once in a while. That's also exhausting, right? It's very depleting to my soul and my spirit, and that requires me to really be anchored and connect that to my spirituality, which is the most important part of my being, right? So I am very grounded in sort of my beliefs in a higher power, in my faith, in God above all, especially country. And I make sure that I start every single one of my days with an immense amount of gratitude, with prayer, with meditation, with scripture. I currently subscribe to Christianity, and I say that from the point of view of like, that doesn't mean that that might shift, but it means that like, that's what I'm studying right now, right? I also do want to study, Judaism and Buddhism and make myself a sort of world global citizen from a religious perspective. And I was raised Catholic as a Latina, and so I'm indoctrinated in Christianity and really being consumed by that. And again, that might shift, and I have a lot of conversations with Jewish friends or again, all kinds of different religions, because I do think it's important for us to even challenge those notions, right? Religion is one of those other things that we don't talk about enough, that we're born into, right? Your parents don't go, do you want to be Catholic or Protestant, or do you want to do Kabbalah, right? Like, no, you're just whatever your parents are. And I think we should also be leaning towards a world of educating our children and giving them choices in terms of who they want to worship, and for me, that is Jesus today, and I think it will be till the end of time, but that I think it's important to sort of also challenge ourselves and disrupt our thinking around that. So I'm just really, really grounded. I haven't always been. This is a very new practice for me as far as like the discipline of it, probably in the last 6 months, and definitely for sure since COVID, to make sure that I commit to it. For me personally, if I'm not centered there, then I really can't do anything to help serve others,
right.
Which in essence, why I do what I do. This isn't about me. This isn't about TikTok. This isn't about, like, for me, it's like God's work, which is just like spread love and help as many people as possible.
Right. It's why in the airplane, you got to take care of yourself first so you can help others, right? You can't love others and spread that love until you've loved your others. So I appreciate that. I've said before that a faith without practice, a faith without action isn't worth a faith believing in. And I think of what you were doing, you were describing that practice of your faith. And I think the other thing that I appreciate is that oneness. I think the one critique that I have of people who often proclaim Jesus is this idea that is the only truth, right? I respect everyone and their truth. And if Jesus is the way to get to their truth, or it's Muhammad, or it's Buddhism, or animism, to each their own. Recognize that we're all climbing this mountain and we all got different paths, and that there's more that we can learn from other people and other ways and other traditions, and to have like genuine curiosity and interest in understanding the other path. Because what you said is I might hop on that at some point. Like, I'm good right now rocking with Jesus, and that's my light right now. But I was interested in that idea of, because I see that as very connected in terms of your life's work, like this practice of prayer and meditation and what you do in the workplace, because you're bringing that. You're not necessarily talking about that light. You're not talking about Jesus, but I think your energy and what you're trying to do in this world is very much rooted in all that. It's spreading love.
Absolutely. And I hope so, right? Because I'm definitely always leading with humility, right? Which is what I get from Jesus and learning about more. And sometimes I gotta knock myself down. I get a little high on myself. We all do. And I have to be reminded. But I pray on my work every single day, and I want it to be about exactly that, right? The more people that I get to interact with daily because they're reaching out to me for something that has nothing to do with a job, but because they feel that I'm someone that they can get support from, or advice or guidance from. I love being that person, both personally and professionally. I love that. I've only been in my current role, or in my current organization. I've been doing what I do for a long time, but in my current organization for 2 months today, right? So 60 days. And I already have so many people that are like, hey, can I get some time with you? Can I get advice on this? Can I, both internally and externally. Like, for me, like, I don't own TikTok. I don't own ByteDance. Like, I love it here. And I'm having a great time, but it's bigger than this, right? If I can touch someone, if I'm on the phone with candidates, I'm like, listen, I'm building people's confidence. I'm prepping them on interviews. I'm like guiding them on areas where I think that they could have improvement. I have external candidates that are calling me about like, hey, I'm really struggling at my job and I'm struggling in general. And I'm saying to them, like, this isn't about getting you to TikTok. This is about getting you to a healthy, emotional, physical, and mental place. And I will help, if it's a job thing, I will help you land wherever you want to go, right? And so I just really lead with that. It is 14-hour days, right? I make myself pretty accessible. I give everybody my phone number. If you send me a message, I am like, here's my cell, text me, call me. I might not be able to talk to you immediately, but I'm like, I'm trying to get to everybody. And I really, again, it's not about me. And I think that the one thing I've learned as I continue in my practice of learning about Jesus or Christianity, or frankly, just a higher power, is that, like, you know, God doesn't walk around tooting his own horn or like making it about God. It just comes in your actions. It just speaks in. I don't have to say I'm doing all of these things versus this conversation. I don't go and tell my boss, here are all the people that I spoke to, hey, give me a bigger check. It's not about the credit. It's about just, you know, doing the work and letting the work speak for itself. And every single human being that I can help in my way is the best that I can do for however long, you know, God will give me the blessing to be on this earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, it's not even what you do; it's your being. Like, we are human beings, right? Like, that is your essence. Like, you're not even thinking about it. You're just being. Hey, Colin, I wanted to let you jump in here, and because I know we only have about 15 more minutes. And did you have any, you know, questions or anything that you wanted to kind of drill into?
There's so much. Thank you for everything you've said so far. I think it really resonates. I love hearing also sort of your take on education. That's my field. I was just thinking, right, as you were talking about, as we dig a little bit deeper, we find how embedded racism is in everything, right? And I thought it was so fascinating that the Supreme Court decision yesterday, I think it was NPR, the New York Times had the title of, like, Supreme Court decision shows, you know, half of Oklahoma might be, like, native territory. Mm-hmm. And I was like, half of Oklahoma? Like, what's the rest of the United States?
Right?
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 You know, there's the superficial things that we can talk about, and I feel like a lot of diversity work and equity and inclusion work, we talk a lot, and Dr. Bettina Love talks about how a lot of diversity and equity and inclusion work in institutions like universities just sort of serves to make white people feel like they're doing something productive. But as we dig a little bit deeper, what's been your experience with that as far as navigating between the sort of superficial and then the deeper sort of action?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So most of it is superficial, right? Let's sort of start there. And some of it is good superficial in the sense where, like, people really just don't know what to do and they want to try to do something, but they don't know how to act. Hence the, like, why we have, you know, Nancy Pelosi in Congress and Kentu Kloss, like, Black Lives Matter. That was a tone deaf moment. And by the way, it was advised by the Congressional Black Caucus. So what does that say about them? Right? So I highlight that example as, like, trying too hard, right? Like, we want to be on the right side of this, but we just aren't willing to take the time that it takes to go real deep in understanding how much has to be dismantled to really be able to make progress. Like, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of things that need to be completely eradicated, re-leveled, restructured in every way, shape, and size. And that means that you're going to have to, like, shut some things down in order to do that. And that's a big ask, but that's what it's going to take. So if I take it sort of to, like, the corporate setting, you know, corporations, they have to have a message. They have to do something, because if they don't, they'll be annihilated in the media. Sure. And then obviously that hits their consumers, their users, their clients, their advertisers, their bottom dollars. So that's why they're immediately spinning their wheels, and they're very reactive instead of proactive. The challenge is that they're part of them. So my tagline at work is, this is not a moment, this is a movement, right? And so a lot of people get on the moment part of it, and aren't willing to really do the movement. And it's like a relationship, right? It's like a marriage. It's like, it's long term, and there's ups and downs, and we're going to have some really tough moments and some uncomfortable situations and conversations, and people are going to be angry and mad and walk out the room, and some people are going to give up and others are going to come back. Like, this is what the work is. And corporations, everyone, it's so easy to be like, oh yeah, we're all about this diversity and equity, inclusion. This makes perfect sense. Like, we're all on the same page. And then you go, okay, great. Now let's do the work. Like, let's get into the work of what this really means. And then that becomes really uncomfortable because, I'll give you an example. So one of the institutions that I worked at, a major company, and this is back to the Rainmaker disruptor. Like, I was like, if you guys really want my honest answer of what a solution is, we need to stop hiring for 6 months to a year. Stop hiring. One, take the opportunity in that 6 months to a year to do pretty strong auditing and analytics and go, like, I'm talking piece by piece. We're looking at absolutely everything, soup to nuts, from a 30,000 foot view and from a 10-foot view of all of the different things that are allowing us to continue to not bridge the gap and to have an institution that continues to be a representative at between 1% and 3% of other. That's what it's going to take, right? Then I go and say to another institution, here's another solution. You feel that you don't have enough black and brown, right? We've already defined what that is at your organization, and you have a representation issue. Why don't you take your company outside of Portland, Oregon, and move it to Atlanta or New York City or Houston?
Hey, I wanted to challenge you on that because Portland's not too, and it's very white, as we all know. I feel like Portland should be doing something to attract people. So I don't know if there's subsidies, right? There's been so much redlining and things that have been happening. So not to disagree with you, because I agree with you, the sentiments and the spirit of what you're saying, but I'm also saying maybe Portland, y'all should be doing something. Maybe Corvallis, you should be doing something, because as soon as we get black and brown people here, they're gone, right? I'm surprised a lot of people, because you just don't feel welcomed here. There isn't that diversity. So those cities need to do something, whether that's providing, to make it more affordable for black and I don't know what it is. There's got to be creative solutions to get people there and get people to stay, because they don't want to be there.
I agree, but I think the challenge is that, like, you've got to do something a little bit more disruptive immediately to have a great impact. And then, so I'm like a yes and person. Yes, and then absolutely Portland, which is, by the way, a dope city, with affordable housing and a great place where, people of color should be considering moving to. Then yes, Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, right? All of these cities in the Pacific Northwest that should be building communities of color, but we don't feel welcomed there. Right. And then we go there and leave. And I got to tell you, every single candidate of color that I've tried to get into tech to move to San Francisco, including myself, is like, hell no. I've heard the worst, or I've been there and I would never go back. I don't care how much you pay me. And then you have these companies that continue to say, well, why can't we get them here? So I just don't think that it's an immediate solution to be able to sort of like get entire cities basically retrofitted. Right. I think it's a good long-term solution. I think it's the same argument, Jonathan, of sort of like when people are like, so I grew up in Boston, and in Boston, we used to ship and bus all the black kids to the suburbs, for schooling, because all the schools in their neighborhoods were terrible. Well, people thought that was great. Oh, at least we're getting the black and brown kids to good schools. No.
Change the schools.
Why don't you build better schools
right
in their neighborhoods so they don't have to be on a bus for 2 hours to get there, right? So, like, That's the same argument you're saying. Like, no, let's just build a Portland that actually provides a community where people of color can thrive and be successful and want to be a part of this community. So I'm totally with you. I think that's like long term. In the interim, I need the Nikes, the Under Armours, the Adidas, the Starbucks, the Googles, the Amazons, the Netflix, whomever of the world to say, we know that there is already a high concentration of really strong, diverse talent in these other communities. So we need to plug and play. We need to bring ourselves to them versus expecting them to come to us.
Right.
Is sort of my take on it, around really having some immediate impact and making some disruptive decisions. Because, you know, listen, I almost went to Nike, you know, and I almost moved to Portland, and I had to sort of decline that opportunity for personal reasons, but very much aligned with how I felt when I was there for just a couple of days, house hunting and really thinking about whether or not this would be a place for me. And you know, I kind of struggled with whether or not it really would be. And who doesn't want to work at a place like Nike? You know, so it's very challenging that we have to make these decisions. And then I tell you the other side of it, which is why I think that the solution of like them coming to us isn't where we're at right now. Man, I can't tell you the number of people of color coming out of, you know, all of the cities that we've discussed and all of the companies that we've discussed with just PTSD, imposter syndrome, heavy trauma, like having to take medical leaves long term, having to completely walk away from their careers because of what they experienced, going to institutions and cities that were not prepared to receive them, to support them, and to set them up for success.
So yes, I agree with everything you said. And for all the Black and brown people listening, we need you in Corvallis. Come out here. I don't know what Corvallis can do, but I missed you.
Yeah, and I'll be a part of that movement. You know, I'm happy to sort of help support that. We're just going to keep y'all accountable to make sure that it's a place where we can thrive.
Well, a lot of people don't know about, you know, yes, the racist history of the U.S. We're all aware, or not, I shouldn't say everyone, but the racist history of Oregon. It was crazy. I grew up in California, in the Bay. I had no idea that Oregon was built as this kind of white utopia. And, I mean, I understand there's so much greenery, you know, we're an hour from the coast, an hour, there's a lot here. Because I've also been thinking about how whiteness, like all of the things, not all the things, but a lot of the things that are really good for us in terms of, you know, maybe eating vegan or vegetarian or even yoga, these things that are rooted actually, like if you look at Africans in East Africa who came here, very much a vegetarian diet. So how did that become white? How did yoga become white, right? And so it's not even, it's almost reclaiming what it means to be Black and brown. Like, nah, that shit ain't white. That's ours.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because it made me think of 2 points. One is, so Beyonce, who I'm obsessed with, she's my queen, so let's just put it out there before I say anything negative against her. She's getting a lot of flack for this new trailer sort of film that she has coming out on July 31st on Disney called Black King. From people that are, you know, African, not African American, Black Africans that are like, we're sick of this imagery of like white painted faces and like feathers, right? Like show yachts, show wealth, show prosperity that are part of African nations as well in how you depict the imagery of who we are as people, right? So to your point about sort of like this reclaiming and, you know, a lot of the things that, listen, white people don't realize that they've stolen everything. That's the reality. I'm still to find one thing that I can say was like originally white. When you guys find that, let me know. But you know, I'll give you an example, which is again, intersectionality, but how it resonates with me. So I'm Dominican. In Dominican Republic, we have 2 types of music, bachata and merengue. Like original from the tribes and the villages of my country, right? Everybody knows salsa. Salsa is like mostly Puerto Rican and Cuban, and at this point it's global, it's commercialized, all good. I thought it was all good until bachata all of a sudden is now becoming that new movement and now becoming super globalized and super commercialized, right? And bachata is like my family, my parents won't listen to it because it was like, you know, dirty dancing music and only found in brothels and, you know, really small villages in DR. And now it's pop music, right? And it's a thing that you can hear pretty commonly if you go anywhere in Latin. I've been in places where I walk in and I've got like a white person or frankly any other person who isn't Dominican telling me how to dance my own music. like, oh, this isn't, you know, but this is not how you do bachata, right? Like, and I'm like, bro, I've been doing this since the womb, literally, right?
Right,
and
right.
that's just what happens when things just get cross-pollinated, when they get appropriated. Shout out to the Kardashians, because we could go on a whole another hour on them appropriating Black culture and using their children as accessories. You know, and I think that that's what the white experience is. It's them, unfortunately, not having enough education and awareness. Like, we always talk about, like, we've robbed, you know, America has robbed us of Black history. And it's like, no, it's American history. So we've also robbed the white people as well. We've robbed every American of really understand. They didn't know either, right? Like, they also didn't know either. They don't know how much racism. They don't know about Black Wall Street. They don't know about FHA loans, you know, or deeds saying that Black people couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. They don't know that information either. And so I'm not saying we need to cut them a break as well. And as we all get more education and awareness about how we've built a country and a social experiment that has been completely set up for white power, white nationalism, and white supremacy.
Yeah, it's all part of the colonial project, right? The colonial mindset, where it's taking land and so it continues, you know, to the cultural, to the music, to the food, to dress, everything.
One of the questions I have, because right now the conversation is focused entirely on Blackness, and I understand and I respect and I support that conversation around Blackness, and I struggle with, because I don't want to dilute that conversation, but I'm also wanting us to bring in, like, our indigenous folk and I guess maybe shine the light on white supremacy as well as Blackness, because that brings the conversation into a more global context.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that takes away from it. Like, my sense is that people are resistant to that.
It doesn't. Listen, I've got one of my really good friends and also colleague, shout out to Shawn Imitates Dog, is like, you know, Native American, born and raised in he's Lakota, born and raised on a reservation in South Dakota, and super, super well-versed and very, very involved in his community. And so, like, that's like my direct line to knowing someone that has a strong Native American background and continues to be really connected to his community. So I spend a lot of time learning from him. I actually, Colin, I sent him the Oklahoma stuff and haven't had a chance to get his POV, but I will share that with you. And by the way, someone to consider having a conversation with on the podcast, right? If you really want to dig deeper.
Yeah.
Part of Native American for sure, but we got to figure out a way to do better by making sure that Native Americans in this country have a voice and a seat at the table. And frankly, like him and I judge about, like we talk about it all the time, I'm like, the real disruptive thing to do would be to make all of us leave and leave the Native Americans, and then they can tell us who the hell can come back in to their land, and then we start from scratch, right? I do sort of steer a lot in sort of Blackness, and I think because that is the topic at hand, and I think that we need to give BLM their moment.
Absolutely.
I think Black people, African Americans, right? I define myself, self-identify as Black, but I'm not African American. That's a different experience, and I want to honor that.
Sure.
This is their moment, so I don't want to talk about everybody else until we get this right for them and their disenfranchisement.
Because I think about like the intersection. Like, there's the, like, fried bread and fried food. Like, you think of soul food and making do with the scraps of crap that you were left with. And you right? That's the resiliency of Black and indigenous culture. And then, what was the reservations? And I think of reparations, right? If we're going to talk about reparations, let's also talk about the reservations, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's just so much there in terms of that resiliency of people to overcome the plight that they've been handed, to overcome. That's the thing about diversity. Like, we talk about diversity, let's talk about adversity. Let's talk about the people and what they've overcome and how that makes them prepared and incredible assets to work in your company, right? Because if they worked 100-degree weather out in the field, like I had a student who wants to be an advocate for farm workers, and then we're going through her resume, And I'm like, oh, where was that experience where you were working in the field? I didn't put that on there because it's not professional. I'm like, well, what is professional? You want to represent these people? You've already done that. You were translating. You know that the conditions, like you got instant credibility, right?
Exactly.
So don't sell yourself short.
Absolutely.
That's that imposter syndrome, right? Not having faith in the fact that we all have stories. We all got experiences, and just knowing how to talk about that.
Yeah, we all have stories. Even the white people have stories.
Yes.
They're powerful stories that we need to have, and we shouldn't separate ourselves. I think we've been taught, especially in the workplace, that like, you know, you mentioned resume, like, oh, that's what I did. That's personally important to me, so it's not professional. No, like we're the intersections of all of that experience is what makes you you, and is what's going to make you a good candidate and therefore employer and contributor to your community and your organization or institution. So that's why, you know, for me, a lot of people say diversity and inclusion. For me, it's equity, inclusion, and diversity. That's the order that I think we should be focused on.
Yes.
Shout out to education, because I think education is frankly the only industry that has conversations about equities and inequities and achievement gaps and ed reform.
But what's really interesting, what I found really surprising when I entered this space 6 months ago, because I agree, I've been in higher education, and you're right, but those conversations haven't been happening in career education, which is fascinating, because I think we have just been parroting what we think corporate America wants to hear. So we're talking about, this is how the world is, and we're going to prepare you for that, as opposed to, as you said, disrupt that system, and let's envision how it should be out there.
Exactly, right? And so back to how multi-layered it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I gave the example of like, oh, what your property tax dictates where your kid goes to school, now you're sitting in an institution, you're you know, working with someone in the career office, and they're teaching you how to prepare to be as white passing as possible to be able to go and actually get a job, so long as you conform to their white passing norms, right? So that's when we code switch, we change our voices, or how we present ourselves, or what we put on our resumes, like all of this stuff that we're just taught. We're just really, really taught. So equity, nobody's talking about equity. You know, people think they're talking about it, but they don't really realize like what that truly is. And so I'm so thankful. So I have a master's degree in higher ed. I started my career in higher education before I sold myself to corporate America.
I was going to ask you that in terms of like making that pivot for those who are listening, who are thinking about pivoting, because it doesn't have to be going from higher ed into corporate. Like it could be from one industry to another.
Correct.
And that pivot and how that worked for you really quickly, because I know we're kind of, I want to be respectful of your time.
It's all good. I love this stuff. I could be here all day. I don't know what else is on my calendar, but I'm sure somebody will find me if there's a fire. Pivot real quick. So I started my career in education, and I had every plan to stay in higher ed. And at some point, I do plan to get my PhD. But my pivot came because a very dear friend who had been in corporate America while I was in higher ed, was transitioning from NBC Universal, which is where she worked, to Fox, another media studio. And she literally called me out of the blue on a Friday night and said, I'm quitting my job on Monday. I'm transitioning to another entertainment company. Are you interested in my job? I will walk in with my resignation and your resume, right? So she's an angel forever, has forever changed my life, and is a really dear friend. And we need people, in our lives to do that for each other, which is why I do it as often as I can. And what I said to her is like, are you crazy? First, I've never been in LA. I've never been to California. I've never worked at a corporation. I knew absolutely nothing about the entertainment and media industry other than like, oh, I know what NBC is. Like, I watch their channel. And she said to me, you know, what you do is the skill. It's not the company. It's not the industry. It's not the function. Recruiting is recruiting is recruiting. If you can convince them that you're willing to learn the business, then I'm sure you can convince them that you can do the job. And I hope she hears this someday, because I don't know if I've ever had the opportunity to share how life-changing that was. And that is my advice to anyone who's looking to make a change. Figure out what you're good at, what you bring to the table, how you contribute, and then figure out a way to pivot that because it's all transferable. You just have to be able to articulate it. You have to be able to sell yourself. You have to be able to connect the dots for other people, but everything we do is transferable. So that's how I made the change. I'm clearly convinced them, and 2 weeks later, I moved to Los Angeles and started my career in the corporate world, and took a step back 2 years ago to go back into education. And I really needed that because I was super depleted in the corporate world. Doing diversity work is incredibly hard anywhere. Doing diversity work in organizations where you're telling rich white men that their systems are broken and that everyone they hire is not the absolute best and that they need to do better is like I'm carrying a boulder up a mountain every single day. So I needed to step away from that, and I went back into education reform. I went into I went to work for the Broad Center. So shout out to the Broad Center, which is an educational nonprofit, really focused on education as an equalizer, closing the achievement gaps in K through 12 public education. Unbelievable organization. So thankful for that experience. And that's really where I feel like I got my master's degree in equity, because every single conversation, every single meeting, every single thing we did was deeply rooted in some of the systemic inequities that exist in public education, and frankly, how that is a microcosm of everything else. So that's how I made the change, and then decided to transition back to corporate for a lot of different reasons, but also because we need us everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. We need us in every industry, we need us in every city, we need us in every function, and I feel that like where I really can make the most impact for people from underserved or underrepresented communities is in the corporate setting, because of the economic empowerment piece, right? From being able to like make it rain, to your point, Jonathan, now I'm going to say that all the time, is, man, I'm at TikTok now. We're a global phenomenon. We are like an incredible company. We're building an amazing product and an amazing community, and this is the time to get in because we're a two-year-old company, so you can be a part of that change and of building this organization. I'm like, sign me up. I want to get as many people through that door as possible, because to me, this is Wakanda right now. To me, this is an absolutely incredible organization that is going to give people access to better their lives and better their careers. And that's why I'm where I am right now, because, you know, most of the time we get shut out from these places.
Well, yeah, you've been at Disney, CAA, Google, Facebook, and now TikTok. And thank you for opening up the doors that you're opening up and for taking the time to be with us today.
And that does it for the third episode of the Soul Force Ones podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Special thank you to Giselle Ruiz for joining us this week. Don't forget you can check us out on all the socials, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Soul Force Ones. As always, thank you to OJ the Producer for our theme song. You can follow him and his work at ojtheproducer.com. And this week's track is Work, brought to you by Zion I and DJ Fresh. Follow them and support independent hip-hop at zionicrew.com. Don't forget to check out some new fresh gear at peopleofcolorclothing.com. 10% off with the promo code SoulForce1s. Tune in next week where we interview Jamon Douglas, Senior Software Engineer at Volta Charging. Until next week, y'all. Peace.